and welcome to the Hybrid School Builders Podcast. I am your host, Rebecca Foley, and I am so glad you are joining me today. I am a fellow grassroots founder who is hoping to make your journey toward founding a sustainable hybrid school a little bit easier. If you are dreaming of starting a hybrid school, or perhaps you've already gotten started, you are in the right place. Join me as we dive into real stories, practical tips, and hard-won lessons that I have learned to help you launch and grow your program with confidence. Remember, building a hybrid school is not just about creating a business or creating jobs. It's not even about just serving the children who attend the program. It's literally about reshaping the landscape of education, and we can do that one community, one entrepreneur, and one program at a time. Hey guys, so today I want to talk about one of the most common questions that a lot of founders have, and that is how to pay yourself. Now, this is kind of bridging the conversation between the staffing structure that you have in your program and budgeting. You can't really budget until you know what your staff is going to be, or at least you can't budget in a really robust, thorough, informed way unless you know what your staff is going to be, which is why I highly recommend starting with at least a 3-year vision of what you'd like your program to look like. Okay. That is so that you don't start small and just focus on the first year or getting your doors open, wear all the hats, work your tail off. And then a year in, maybe you're growing or there's a lot of demand for your program and you're trying to decide whether you should grow or not. And you have underpaid yourself or maybe worked for free or whatever. And in order to afford the growth or meeting the demand, you would have to jack up your tuition a lot. Okay. And what we're trying to avoid is doing that once the program is in full swing, because parents and families generally don't like thinking that they're signing up for a program that's going to cost X amount of dollars and then getting into it and finding out that it's going to be significantly more than that. Okay. A moderate amount is sometimes okay, especially if you are really upfront with your parents and say, we didn't realize how high rent was going to be or whatever, the significant surprise was. I have been in that place before. But in general, you want to avoid that as much as possible, especially if it's really significant. Okay. So how do you pay yourself? You pay yourself just like you pay all of your other bills in your budget. You create a budget. You put in all of the expenses that you know you're going to have. You do some actual estimates as far as everything from you rent, if you're having to rent a space, like go talk to actual places and get actual numbers from them, which is why you're doing a lot of that prep work early on. You can have a preliminary skeletal budget based on, numbers that other people have told you or, you've taken from some other place. I have a sample one in my strategic planning course based on real numbers that I operated on. And that's probably going to be pretty close, but you also need to know, every area is different. What's available to you is different. Wages are different. All of these things are different and they can be fairly significant. Okay. That's why it's really important to start with your vision and your mission. You start there. You make sure you know what your first year is, you're hoping your first year will look like, and it seems realistic, but also project out 3 years or 5 years. An example of this might be, I just want to have 2 classes of 25 kids total and, maybe 12 kids and 12 kids. And we're just going to do like a pre-K and a K. And that's all we're ever going to do. That might be your 3-year plan, where your 1-year plan is I'm going to try to get just the pre-K class started and I'm going to try to get 10 kids in it. That might be your 1st-year plan. But by my 3rd year, I want a fully functioning pre-K and K. But that's where I'm going to stop. Okay. But if you're just like, well, I'm going to open a kindergarten in a 1st grade or maybe a 1st and a 2nd grade the 1st year, and I'm going to see if people respond. And if they do, I'm going to add a third grade, and then I'm going to add a fourth grade, and I'm going to add a fifth grade. And I would love to go all the way up through sixth grade or eighth grade or something like that. Okay, if that's what you can say, then your vision is growth. You're going to need more teachers. You're going to need more aides. Supervising the teachers is going to be a job, a full part-time job. And you need to make sure you understand that. Staffing infrastructure, that's what I think it was my last episode was about. Okay. So that's why it's really important to look forward into the future a bit. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to get all the numbers down perfectly. It doesn't mean your estimates are going to be exact, but you want to make very well-informed estimates for all of your staffing and your rent and all of that. Okay. Now, I'm saying all of this because it's really about budgeting, and where you plug yourself into that budget as a staff member is going to depend on, your personal evaluation of your own skills and strengths and experience, because you want to put yourself into a place where you're going to thrive in the long run. Unless you plan on this just being a short-term thing that you're going to do for a few years and then it's going to close and it's only going to be as big as you, which is fine if that's what it is, but make sure you let your families know that, and make sure you state that clearly for yourself, because that's going to influence your business structure. It's going to influence, your plans. It's going to influence, maybe even your space. It's going to influence a lot of things if that's your plan, but you also don't have to create something that's bigger than you if that's your plan. Okay. What I'm talking about is creating a business that's organizationally sound and stable and sustainable, in the sense that it holds itself up. Okay. And the infrastructure is there with the staff, that every position knows what it is supposed to do. It's funded properly. There are the proper positions so that the program can thrive and people aren't burning out or way overworked or way underpaid. That's not sustainable. Okay. Those things aren't sustainable. What I'm shooting for is a program that is sustainable in the long run, that is going to be bigger than you. Okay. So that's why we're starting with the proper staffing infrastructure, which is built upon what your vision is for the first several years, or even, long run. And, that what I mean by that, if it helps at all, is that obviously the staff you have your first 1 or 2 years, if you plan on growing, isn't the same staff you're going to have in years 6 and 7. As the kids come and the classes get added, you have the funds to add the staff. And that might not, obviously you need a teacher every time you add a class. Every 2 to 3 classes, you might need another aide. But the income from the tuition for the kids, assuming the class size is proper and the tuition is properly set, is going to fund that additional staffing. But you also want to be able to have that administrative and director and those supporting things. You want to have enough money to support those as well if they shift, or if the amount of work that those people have to do is increasing as the program grows. Okay. So you understand your staffing infrastructure, make sure that you're heading in a direction that it's going to sustain itself as it grows, because it's got all of the positions are there and they're funded. And I'll talk about this in another episode, but you're adding all that up along with all the other expenses you have, and you are coming up with a total basically of what this is going to cost. And then from there, you work backward to what your tuition is going to be. If you're a nonprofit and you plan on fundraising, especially if it's a significant amount of the cost, well, at least now you know what your cost per child is going to be. So even if you end up charging, zero tuition, or, lower tuition, and then making up the difference with fundraising and donations, you know what that target number needs to be to cover all of your costs. Okay. So you're adding up all your costs, and then you're working backwards to find what the cost per child is. And then you're figuring out whether you're going to charge that as tuition or fundraise it, or a combination of the two if you're a nonprofit. Okay. Now, how do you actually pay yourself and determine the salaries? Just like anytime you hire anybody, whether it's just you and one aide or it's you and two teachers and that's it, right? When you're hiring anybody, you need to understand what the role is, how many hours they're working, what their responsibilities are, and you want to make sure that what is a competitive wage in your area for that type of work, and you want to set your pay there, okay? You have to remember when you're doing your actual budget, some practical things like workers' comp insurance and taxes. You're going to have to pay employer taxes, which is fairly significant, close to 10%. You have to remember all of those things when you're doing your budgeting. But for just setting the pay, you want sustainability. So you don't want anything sitting on one person's just goodwill for too long. And all that to say, your first year as an entrepreneur, as the person who's creating this, the strategist here, you are going to be putting in a lot of goodwill in the beginning. And that first year, maybe even two, you might not be able to get paid, your fair market wage, because that's just the entrepreneur's sacrifice, right? Unless you fill every single class the very first year with all of the kids that you ideally would like for your program, and they're all paying the tuition that you want, which can happen if you do your market research really well and you're pretty sure that everyone's out there and you've advertised and the word of mouth is out there. That could happen, but a lot of times it takes a year or two or three for the momentum to pick up and for, your reputation to be built and word of mouth to spread about your program. And it might take 2 or 3 years to fill those classes so that you actually have the full revenue that you were shooting for. Okay. So for any of those positions, again, you want to know what the competitive in the sense that it doesn't have to be a really high wage, because that's not what I mean by competitive, but it needs to be fair. Okay. Because especially in a hybrid program. Now, if you're a micro school and you're, full time, then it may be very close to what a small private, like a tutoring program or a school. It's pretty hard to compete with an elite private school or a public school as far as salaries and benefits and all of that. It's very difficult to do that as a small program unless you charge really high tuition. But if you look at usually smaller Christian schools, I think the average Christian school to pay for teachers, when I had researched it, was around $40,000 to $45,000, which is obviously quite low compared to, other types of full-time schools. But there's usually a missional component, and there's a lot of support and kind of an environment that will draw a certain type of people who are willing to work with small classes and a particular type of philosophy and all of that kind of thing. And so that can work to your advantage. If they only have to teach 10 kids or 12 kids, or even 15 kids, and it's a very small supportive environment, a lot of people, that's fine. They will work for that kind of lower salary. But it's still kind of like a fair salary, right? Now, if you're a hybrid program, you are going to take kind of a percentage of that, especially for your teachers. If you're meeting about a third of the days of full-time school, which might meet 180 days plus training time and in-service time, you're meeting, say, 60 days, you could take a third, right? So if a teacher is making $45,000 at the local Christian school, and they might make $15,000 with you or something like that. So you want to do a little bit of research on it. Another thing that can work to your advantage if you're a hybrid school looking for part-time employees is that you are digging into a different group of people than full-time schools are, okay? Now, it depends on how you look at it. I would say it's an advantage because a lot of times a position like this will draw people who are not looking at full-time work. They don't want to work full-time. And once you get into part-time work, you're already pretty much giving up benefits and all of that kind of thing, okay? So a lot of times positions like this will draw maybe moms who used to be teachers or maybe even retirees or people fresh into the workforce out of college, and they're not looking for full-time work. Or they've been home with their kids for several years. That's a common demographic in hybrid school hiring that I've seen, is that they have experience with kids. Maybe they were teachers previously, then they spend several years home with their kids, and they just want to work part-time, and they especially want to work with their children's schedule. And that means that they're happy to make $12,000 or $15,000 and work 2 days a week for the school year with their children. They're quite happy to do that because they're not going to go work 5 days a week and make 40 or 50 or 60,000. That's just not what they want to do. Okay, they only want part-time work. So that could work to your advantage. Okay, now I got into hiring other people, but the same thing applies to you. So whether if you're going to be one of the teachers, apply that to you. If you had to replace yourself, how much would you have to pay the person for the skill set that you need them to have? Now, a lot of founders, of course, as I said in the other episode, end up as the directors. And that is a higher responsibility in the sense that you have to supervise and coach multiple teachers. A lot of times you're doing the curriculum planning. So make sure you understand that staffing infrastructure. Listen to that episode and see how many of those hats you're going to wear. But I think that it's very helpful to break down each of those positions into like the roles and responsibilities that go into each position, how many hours is going into it per week, the level of responsibility that it holds, and if you had to go hire someone, what kind of skills would you be looking for? What kind of experience would you be looking for? And what would you consider a fair salary to give them? Okay. And that's the number you're putting in your budget to get your total operating expenses, which will then determine your tuition. Okay. And the mistake a lot of founders will make is they just kind of leave themselves out. They're just like, well, I'm going to hire 2 teachers and that's going to be my program. And they say, well, I guess I'll need to pay them this much. And then we have rent and all this other things. And then they kind of add it up. Or, which I think this is even worse, is if you start with the tuition and say, well, I think I'll charge about this number. And you just come up with a number that you think people will pay. I don't know if anyone actually does this, but please don't do this. You come up with a number that people will actually pay, but you haven't actually worked to it backwards from what your actual expenses are going to be. Then you could end up in all sorts of trouble. Okay. So you definitely want to start with all of your expenses. Always build in a cushion. Try to run a 10% plus above what you add everything up as pretty generously, but realistically, and then add 10% to it and make that your total number. Okay. I budgeted like that for years, and it was certainly tight in the beginning, especially as I was trying to recover from the fact that I did not put the pay of the administrators in, the founders in, just because I didn't know what the 3rd year was going to look like, or 4th year. I had no idea. So that was tight, trying to come up with that money. It was difficult to do. But if I had started from the beginning, I would have set the tuition a bit higher and it wouldn't have been as tight. And eventually there was plenty of money, but it was certainly tight for a long time in the beginning. And then there was enough. And then you're slowly able to start putting money away. And we also had grants and some fundraising that definitely helped a lot with filling some of those gaps and covering some of those surprises that came along through rapid growth. So how do you pay yourself? If I could say it in a couple sentences, make sure you understand your staffing infrastructure. Okay, what positions you need. Fund those positions in your budget with a fair number, and do not leave yourself out of that. Okay. Everything that you're doing, everything that needs to be done needs to be a position in the budget. Okay. Get your total and then work backwards to get your tuition, and make sure you're charging enough tuition with the pay in the budget. Okay. And one more quick thing about that. I talked a little bit in the staffing infrastructure about how the entrepreneurial strategist is absolutely essential in the beginning and through growth. Okay. Like when you're planning new programming and, you're still trying to stabilize, it's really, really important. But it's not really something that becomes a permanent position. So that's the one part. And it's literally what you're doing right now as you're listening to this podcast, and maybe you're scribbling some numbers down, or you're, thinking about what a budget might look like and what salaries might look like. That's literally what you're doing right now. It's hard to put your finger on that in the long run, like what that position is. It's essentially a business owner position. It's like a strategist, which is what a board should be doing in a nonprofit. but it's also like something that a director of an entire program, which is often the business owner, whatever, it's that like oversight position of everything is the person who's doing that. But there's less and less of it to do once the organization matures. Okay. So because of that, again, that's an entrepreneurial like sacrifice you kind of make. You probably aren't going to be getting paid very much for that part of the work that you're doing. So make sure that you have a place for yourself as you go forward. And another way to look at that could be if you had to hire a consultant to help you with this part, and it's like many, many hours of planning and budgeting and strategizing, right? But you're only going to need them for the first year, and then maybe on a consultant basis for the first few years or something like that. You could say, well, it's going to cost me this much money. Okay, well, set that as a salary for the first year, or however you want to put it in your budget for yourself, so that you get reimbursed or recompensed for the time that you're putting in, even if it's only for the first year. Okay, and then if you're going to hire everything else out and you're just going to like help here and there when you need to later on, then you're not so much in the budget. You might just kind of be like a consulting person, and you might put that in the budget as like a consultant. But if you're actually going to be the director, which is what most founders are, you're kind of transitioning from that, and you're only drawing upon those entrepreneurial skills here and there. Most of the time, you're just doing the operational stuff of like supervising the program once the program has become more mature. Okay? So that's how you pay yourself. Make sure you have a good budget. Work your tuition backward from there, and do that early on before you've announced to everybody what your program is going to cost. Okay? Thanks so much for listening today. Don't forget to subscribe and make sure you check out the resources I am developing at startahybridSchool.com. Send me an email anytime. I would love to hear from you. Until next time.